Florida Governor Ron DeSantis kicked off the Conservative Political Action Conference, saying his state, quote, defeated Fauciism. He made no mention of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The four-day conference, known as CPAC, features a number of Republican lawmakers. Former Democratic Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard is there as well. It wraps up with a keynote address from former President Donald Trump. The gathering has traditionally been a sort of bellwether to gauge party support for those with bigger political aspirations. Most Republicans have condemned Vladimir Putin's moves, but some are aligning with former President Trump, who called Putin, quote, pretty smart on Wednesday evening. Many Republicans are agreeing that President Biden's leadership during this time has been insufficient. Here's what Senator Ted Cruz told our CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa during an interview at CPAC.
But is President Trump's choice of words on Putin problematic or not?
Listen, there are lots of things, President.
In terms of foreign policy.
Look, I get the press always wants to get Republicans fighting amongst each other.
I'm just curious about your take on it.
There are lots of things President Trump says that I wouldn't say. And his rhetoric, I, with some regularity, disagree with. But if you actually look at policy, who actually stood up to Russia? It's not even close. Donald Trump signed into law the sanctions that I wrote to stop Nord Stream 2. He did so not once but twice.
And Robert Costa joins me now from Orlando. Good to see you, Robert. What are the big takeaways from day one of CPAC?
It's great to be with you. CPAC is usually a debut opportunity for Republican stars as they look toward a presidential race. But what was most notable, other than all the speeches here and people trying to make their appeals to the Republican base, is that there wasn't a lot of talk about the crisis with Russia and Ukraine. Much more talk about domestic issues and President Biden.
And why do you think that is?
There's a lot of GOP division, as we've reported for CBSNews.com about this, within the GOP about how to handle foreign policy. Traditionally, the Republican Party has been hawkish on Russia, but whether it's conservative media outlets or people like Senator Hawley of Missouri, who's a rising star himself in the party, you have much more of a non-interventionist streak, a non-hawkish approach to issues like Russia. So there's not a clamor to have U.S. troops on the ground fighting this war. I spoke to Senator Hawley and Senator Cruz, and they both had very similar messages.
Yeah, and I guess from your conversations on the ground, how are conservatives responding to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
You really see the influence, Nicole, of former President Donald Trump, who had a different kind of approach to Russia. Many of his critics called it a soft approach. He was someone who didn't want to chastise Vladimir Putin for all of his aggression abroad. That view of Putin, that view of foreign policy, has really seeped into the Republican Party. And that new kind of vein of foreign policy thinking is on display here.
Yeah, and kind of dive a little deeper here, because Republicans have really kind of historically been pretty entrenched against authoritarian regimes. The U.S. fought wars with the goal of limiting the spread of communism. So what changed here?
What changed is former President Trump. And this new dynamic is something, Nicole, that President Biden's going to have to face down as he goes to Capitol Hill as this crisis continues. There is a lot of interest among Republican lawmakers here to have aggressive sanctions against Putin, but not necessarily any kind of fighting force abroad. In fact, some of these senators who are speaking at CPAC are talking about even withdrawing some troops, U.S. troops, from NATO countries in Europe.
And, you know, just to touch base with respect to former President Trump. I mean, as you know, in terms of how he has described Vladimir Putin, I mean, most recently he called him savvy. I mean, are you seeing other Republicans go that far with their language about the Russian president?
Not so many Republican lawmakers, but certainly conservative activists. I was struck in my reporting earlier today here in Orlando that Charlie Kirk, a conservative activist, went on stage and said he doesn't support dictators, but he believes the U.S., in terms of its policy priorities, should be focused on the southern border and what he called an invasion there of undocumented workers rather than the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. And it's that kind of rhetoric that's pervasive here at CPAC, an activist view that intervention abroad isn't necessary. All eyes should be on the southern border and following in President Trump's footsteps.
And as you mentioned at the top, this conference is often an opportunity for rising stars in the party to address party faithful. This is obviously happening on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' home turf. Is he trying to set up for a 2024 presidential run?
He right now just has to get through his 2022 re-election race for governor here in Florida. He's mentioned by so many attendees I've spoken with as a possible 2024 presidential contender. What was notable about his speech here Thursday at CPAC in Orlando is that he did not mention in any significant way former President Donald Trump in his speech. He also did not wade into foreign policy. Even though Ukraine is front and center, Russia front and center, Governor DeSantis did not touch those issues. He instead touted his own record in Florida. That shows you a politician trying to be careful in terms of what he gets into on policy, focused on his own race. But eventually, if he wants to run for president, we're going to have to hear more about his own worldview.
Some interesting observations. Robert Costa, thank you.
Thank you.